one thing the transfer portal has kind of opened up is, you've got these kind of interior Midlands landlocked region states that maybe aren't as appealing to these kids out of high school. And now because of the transfer market, they get to see the opportunities that all these schools have. And yeah, NIL, padding the pockets helps a little bit, but it's just fun to see some of the guys that end up kind of coming back around on an opportunity at Kansas or Kansas State, where in high school, again, Caleb Medford would have been like, nah, I'd rather stay in the DFW area. I think now they see the opportunities.
Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank. If you're thinking about starting a business or know someone who is, check out Emprise Bank's SBA loans. It's always good to know your options, and they can be your partner in possible.
Hello, and welcome back to the Verbal Commitment Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network, brought to you by Home Field Apparel. I'm Kevin Flaherty, and I'm here with Ryan Wallace from GoPowerCat.com and 24/7 Sports, and we're talking about the world of local recruiting, from Kansas and Kansas City prospects to the college classes at Kansas, Kansas State, and Missouri. Typically, that means a lot of high school recruiting talk, but it's portal time, and with all three schools extremely active right now, we decided to talk about not just the most recent transfers to pick each school, but also to look at each school's class as a whole. As always, if you like what you're hearing, tell your friends about us, subscribe, hit that like button, or leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts, like Apple or Spotify. All those things help us to grow the show and put us in front of more people like you. Before we get started, Ryan, how did you and your family deal with Snowmageddon this past weekend?
Let's just say, I think I said this on, maybe it was our last episode, but like, we were searching and longing for our routine back, Kevin. And again, in this household, and again, I think parents kind of understand, but like, you kind of come to a point like at the end of a holiday season when you're like kind of looking forward to getting back to the office. When you're kind of looking forward to the kids getting back in school, they're kind of itching to get back in school. And so the way that the snow days came, it was like, man, if we could have had these snow days in, say, February, you're like, man, that was nice. Like that's the breather that I needed. But coming like directly like at the end of a holiday break, you couldn't even really enjoy it, Kevin. It was just like delaying the inevitable. You're like, I don't want these snow days right now. Like, I want to leave the house. You're starting to have some like COVID flashbacks, right? Some PTSD of like being stuck in your home. So, I don't know. I didn't really enjoy it that much. I mean, shoveling like 3 times in a day isn't really fun. I mean, you appreciate it the next day when you're not shoveling like all 11 inches, but you quickly. Let me toss it back to you by saying this. I realized during this Snowmageddon that the age is hitting quickly, because I found myself like grunting and like heating heating pack on my back, unlike I ever have before. And it was a sign that the sooner that I don't want the kids to grow up, but the sooner they get old enough where I can chip a few dollars at them to do things like that on their own. Can't wait, Kevin.
It was a little bit like if you would compare it to a football team getting a bye week too early, right? Like, season started. We need this bye week in the middle of the season so that we can recover. We don't need that week 3 bye week and then 8 weeks in a row. And so the timing certainly could have been
not ideal.
But Ryan, can we get one big alarm for all 3 local schools?
Let's do it.
Go into the work that they've done in the portal recently. Let's go ahead and start with K-State, which has been the busiest of the local teams in the portal this past week. The Wildcats landed 4 players in the last week. This show is airing on January 10th, so Gabe Irvin Jr. just missed, but those include the order that they committed: South Alabama cornerback Marianne Fortenberry, Alabama edge Jay-Sean Ross, Wagner offensive tackle Brandon Snee, and New Mexico wide receiver Caleb Medford. Ryan, where do you want to start?
Oh, well, I mean, let's just start with probably the biggest name, the biggest prize, if you will, from like a transfer rating standpoint or recruiting rating standpoint. It makes sense for our show. He's from Kansas City, Liberty North, and St. Pius's own Ja'Shawn Ross. Kevin, it was an interesting get. I'll put it that way, from the standpoint of not a position that K-State really needed to add to the defensive end room. But when you get a guy like Ja'Shawn that's, 6'5", 6'4", 6'5", about probably anywhere between 240, 250 pounds, doing the things that he's capable of doing in the day and age when the roster management is big time and we're starting to cut down to, 105, 110. You want the biggest and the baddest and the best, as many as you can get on a roster. He's a guy that you're willing to roll the dice on. And if that disrupts the order of the room or whatever, like, I think you have to make that move, because I think you would agree with me, Kevin, like when you think about, at least in my time covering the Kansas City metro area and the most lethal, dynamic pass rushers that I've seen, Ja'Shawn Ross is up there with, PJ PJ from North Kansas City.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm blanking on his last name. I was like PJ. Also, like a guy like, wow, I'm just completely blanking on everybody here.
That's how good he is. He makes you forget every other.
This is sad. But anyway, he's like top 3 that I've ever seen. And so again, it's worth the dice roll for Kansas State. I'm curious to see how they use him. There's been some talk about like maybe the K-State scheme going to not really a 4-man front, but maybe kind of utilizing a little bit more of that, where he would be kind of like what they're calling a big cat, kind of more of your typical hybrid off the edge. And I think he'd be just completely dynamic at that. But that was probably the most interesting one. If you want to talk about the one that they needed the most, I think it's Brandon Snee, and it's not even close. And I tweeted it out, Kevin, that, he's from Wagner. And before Wagner, he came from a Division II school in North Carolina. And so he's worked his way up the ladder. They get him late in the portal window for an offensive tackle, and they kind of swung and missed or attempted to get some bigger name tackles that maybe had some more proven track record at a higher level, and they didn't get him. But that being said, I don't know if Brandon Snee is that much of like a, kind of last minute ad from the standpoint of like, well, he's the best guy left. I think he's pretty darn good. 6'6", 6'7", well over 300 pounds. The mobility, the footwork is tremendous. Is there going to be a transition from the FCS level at Wagner to the Big 12? Yeah. We saw Easton Kilty come from North Dakota in a conference that is much more well-respected and well thought of than Wagner's conference. And he had a little bit of a transition to make. He wasn't maybe as dominant right out of the gate for Kansas State at left tackle this past season as maybe I and others thought he might be. But Brandon Wagner was a guy, or Brandon Snee from Wagner was a guy you had to have. When you look at K-State's offensive makeup, they needed some receivers. They needed some help there. There were some other elements like, getting a Gabe Irvin to spell Dylan Brooks and Joe Jackson. Like, yeah, that's nice, but they're breaking in some fresh faces up front. And, as much as I like John Pastore, as much as Andrew Langang proved himself at times at right tackle, they needed a real proven tackle that you could lean on. And I think they finally got one with Snee. He was absolutely huge. And Fortenberry was pretty big because you go out and you get a Jaden Rowe from Oklahoma, but there's some health concerns that he hadn't really ever proven himself at that position. And they like some of the younger guys that they have, Kevin, at cornerback. But again, some inexperience there. So to bring in a guy like Fortenberry, who's still what you would call young, he's not a senior, he's not a grad student, but he's awfully sticky. He's proven it this past season in a quality conference against some speed, a really good, pretty sound tackler in the open field. To me, Snee and Fortenberry were two guys that they really needed. Took them a while to get there, but they finally got what they needed here late in the window.
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of filling those needs. And Snee's a guy that I feel like is underrated from a transfer rating standpoint and where he's at on those charts. I think he could wind up being, day one starter, really good. And the other thing, Ryan, is Kansas State, I think, is going to be so good at the skill positions that the only thing that kind of would lock up that offense is if they aren't good up front, if they can't block guys. And so you had to go out there and get better. The Jay-Sean Ross thing, I think it's a swing on NFL potential. It really is, because the best version of Jay-Sean Ross is an early day NFL draft pick. We both seen him. He's super fluid for how big he is. He rushes the passer in a way you just don't see typically. There's a reason Nick Saban, got him to come to Alabama in the first place. And so when you look at that, I don't necessarily mind that swing. Caleb Medford, like you said, joining that group of wide receivers that they're trying to fill out a little bit more. And so really good week for the Wildcats.
I'll get back to wide receivers, I think, in our second part, right, when we kind of go over the overall class, because I do want to touch on the receivers for a minute. But getting back to what you said about Jay-Sean Ross too, when Nick Saban came up to Liberty North, I was told that's what really sealed the deal for Alabama with Jay-Sean initially, because remember, he had taken a visit to Kansas State as a senior. He was flirting with Nebraska a little bit, but when Nick Saban, as you said, Kevin, comes up to Kansas City, it really, I think, proved and showed to him how badly Alabama really wanted him, that he wasn't just another guy for them. And coincidentally, I've kind of heard between, the through the grapevine, if you will, that I think that's part of the reason Jay-Sean is leaving Alabama, because this is a kid that won like the Ozzie Newsome, I think it was freshman, like most improved defensive player in their spring session this last spring. But I think the way that Saban's staff really was there for him and had everything structured for him, I don't know if that quite got handled or handed off with Kalen DeBoer. And I think there wasn't that relationship that he had with some of the guys on the Saban staff. And so that's how we saw him get to the transfer portal. That's why he chooses Kansas State, as that opportunity that he felt during that official visit. And finally, Kevin, I remember the name that I was bumbling and fumbling all over here, 5-10 minutes ago as I'm rambling. Chester Graves.
Yes.
Chester Graves from Park Hill was the name I could not think of. So he's up there. He's definitely up there with those types. It'll be, again, very, very interested to see his usage for Kansas State.
Kansas has been the most active local school over the entirety of the transfer portal window, landing a whopping 20 players. And Kansas filled two more major needs this week with West Virginia linebacker Trey Lathan and McNeese State punter Finn Lappin. Lappin averaged 46.1 yards per punt this year, and Kansas has an opening at punter for him to step right into. But let's focus on Lathan, who's a proven Big 12 linebacker coming over from the Mountaineers.
Yeah, I mean, he was like an All-American get for West Virginia, and a guy that kind of stuck it out for West Virginia. And I mean, obviously they didn't have quite the season that they wanted, and Neil Brown can attest to that because he's no longer the coach there. But we'll get to him in a minute with Missouri. But like Trotter and Lathan, those two guys kind of, Trotter's more that hybrid, but I mean, their linebacker core was pretty sound. Some pretty good guys that can cover, and again, seems to fit what Kansas needs, right, Kevin?
Yeah, I would say so. They needed to fill some linebacker spots, and even beyond that, I think Kansas is going to be terrific up front at those defensive tackle spots. Trey Lathan, I think one of the things that you see on tape was he ate some blocks last year that maybe he wasn't expecting. I think that defensive line, while talented, kind of got out of gap integrity quite a bit. He has a chance to play a little bit more downhill in Lawrence than maybe he was able to at West Virginia. Real quick, before we go to break, not to be forgotten, Missouri upgraded its secondary this past week with the additions of cornerback Stephen Hall from Washington State and a guy KU fans are very familiar with in safety Jalen Catalon of UNLV. Catalon would have been a good get anyway, but he also picked off Jalen Daniels and returned it 46 yards to set up a huge score in the Rebels' win over the Jayhawks this year. And it should be noted, Daniels and Kansas will take on Catalon and Missouri in Columbia on September 6th. So what stands out to you about Catalon and Hall, Ryan?
Well, I just like, he's a proven guy. I mean, this is a guy that, has done it at multiple levels now. was a standout again on a UNLV team that was flirting with the college football playoff there for a long time. And, as we'll get to on the other side, I think he strengthens what was a terrific haul at safety by the Tigers. I love what Missouri did at that position. And so to add Catalan on what probably would have already been a position that I would have lauded anyway, this is like an exclamation point for them. Again, kind of at a position that they've got lucky the past couple of years. They got some guys that had some extended eligibility. And now that those guys are kind of moving on, I think, you can put Catalan and some of these others that we'll get to on the other side of the break with a guy like Marvin Burks Jr. And now you've got guys that are not only physical and can come up and lay the wood, but also have the speed, have the coverage ability to hang with the best in the SEC. And Eli Drinkwitz knows you got to have some guys on the back that can give your cornerback some help, but can also come up and play physical against those, talented rushers that the SEC has too. It's an NFL style of offense that they're playing over there in that league. And, again, I think Catalan fits. And again, he's a guy that has proven it at a number of different places now. That very rarely has he had, what you'd consider a hiccup.
We're going to take a deeper look at Kansas State, Missouri's transfer classes here after the break. But first, we want to tell you about our friends at Home Field Apparel. Whether you need some warm joggers to get out and plow through the snow, or great-looking vintage knit sweaters and quarter zips to fill out your winter arsenal, you can find them with your favorite schools' colors and logos, including some cool retro ones at Home Field. Kansas State, and Missouri fans will all have more than 40 items to choose from. So head over to homefieldapparel.com and use the promo code link below in the description, and you can get 15% off your first order. We'll be right back.
Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com.
Welcome back to the Verbal Commitment Podcast, sponsored by Home Field Apparel. Ryan, let's go ahead and start with Missouri here. The Tigers currently have 15 transfers in their class, ranked as the number 11 transfer class in the country, according to 24/7 Sports. 2 of those players are 4 stars, and I'd like to hit on both of them. First, Missouri has to replace some terrific talent and production at wide receiver, and the Tigers' highest-ranked transfer get is Mississippi State's Kevin Coleman, a St. Louis native who started his career under Coach Prime at Jackson State. What did you think of the get?
Well, you and I were talking, kind of previewing this episode, and I was like, I don't remember Kevin Coleman, and you reminded me he was part of that kind of Jackson State amazing get that they got at wide receiver with Travis Hunter in that class, and then it was like, oh yeah, like he's the kid from St. Louis that picked Jackson State, and no offense to Jackson State, was much better than Jackson State. Kind of had his pick of the litter, and now he comes back as a transfer a second time out of Mississippi State. And I did flip on some tape of him, Kevin, and I think this is a great fit. I mean, not only is he coming back home, being able to put on the Missouri uniform and carry that Tiger pride, right, growing up around the St. Louis area, now he has an opportunity to really follow in a fellow St. Louis guy's paths and footsteps in Luther Burden, because the tape, it's like, okay, if you're trying to sell Coleman on an opportunity at Missouri, you literally throw on the tape of Luther Burden, because they're so similar in their style, like their stature, everything. His burst is tremendous. You can put him in the slot. You can have him out wide. And I just think he's got that breakaway speed to do all the things that they did with Luther Burden, and then kind of complement him with some bigger receivers on the outside. Obviously, they're having to make up for Theo Weiss and others, but I mean, you got Josh Manning on the outside. We know him in Kansas City, love him in Kansas City, and know kind of what he can do. Now you complement him with a Coleman, the same way you complimented a Weiss and others with a Luther Burden.
Yeah, you bring in Donovan Olugbade as well, a top high school recruit that I think could join that rotation pretty quickly. Joining Coleman in the 4-star club is Louisiana Monroe running back Ahmad Hardy, who rushed for 1,351 yards and 13 touchdowns as a freshman this year. Ryan, another year, another transfer running back who seems like he could thrive getting the ball in that Missouri offense.
Yeah, and again, you mentioned it. Their transfer running backs have been very good, and they find guys, to me, that I think balance is a key word, right? And like low center of gravity is big. And again, when I threw on tape of Hardy, Kevin, he kind of reminded me of a fellow Louisiana college player that also hit the transfer portal market this year, Tulane's Mekhi Hughes. Like,
Yep.
there's this low center of gravity, but also an element of probably better breakaway speed for Hardy, which he'll need in the SEC. And a guy that also is going to bring multiple years of eligibility, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that's big. Missouri hasn't really had that at times in what they've gotten out of the transfer portal at running back. Now they've got a guy that I think not only can come in and be in that rotation from day one, but that you aren't pushing to be the guy day one. He can kind of be a running back by committee if you don't feel like he's ready right away. If not, you've got him as your starter right now and for future years. Again, I really like how he bounces off of contact and yet still has the breakaway speed in the second and third levels. Really good get for them. Underrated from kind of the Sun Belt League, right? I think it's easy for fans to look at that and kind of scoff at it. But I think there's a lot to like there when you put him behind the type of offensive line that Missouri's going to have.
Yeah, I would agree. You talked about a strong transfer safety class. Two of the guys that kind of stood out to me in the class, Northwest Missouri State defensive end Langdon Kitchen at 6'7", 270 pounds. He had a lot of interest, including from Kansas. Did K-State come after Kitchen as well?
I think if they did show some interest, it was too little too late.
And Penn State quarterback commitment, Bo Perbula. Brady Cook is moving on. Matt Zollers is a true freshman and coming off an injury. And the guys between aren't proven yet. Why not add a toolsy guy like Perbula, who played for Penn State this year as a runner and change of pace guy, to Drew Aller to help bridge that gap in that quarterback room?
Well, and yeah, I mean, Missouri saw what Brady Cook could do for that offense in terms of scrambling, and now you get Perbula that's probably a little bit more known for his running ability. If they can kind of groom him a little bit from a passing standpoint, kind of the same way they groomed Brady Cook, and again, kind of create that bridge to the younger guy, it's a great pickup. But Kevin, I got to go back to the safeties here. I mean, about Catalan, obviously his history at Arkansas, his history at Texas, again, proven along the way, to get him, but then to also counterbalance that with a guy like Santana Banner, amazing length when I looked at him. And again, multiple years of eligibility, but Mose Phillips from Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
What a get. I love Mose. The more I kind of watched him a little bit from Virginia Tech, a starter, a guy that plays with a level of tenacity and aggressiveness that I think fits what Missouri wants. He should translate so easily to the SEC, and I think he is a no doubt immediate impact guy from day one. It's a really, really strong, balanced. You've got a guy like Catalan that has a lot of experience and only like a year left, but you've also got some other guys in Banner and Phillips that have multiple years of eligibility, and all of those guys could be real difference makers for the Tigers this year and moving forward.
Well, let's go ahead and move on to K-State now, which has 12 transfers in the class. As we mentioned in the Open, the highest-ranked player in the Wildcats class is Ja'Shawn Ross. In Kansas State's transfer class currently sits at 50th on 24/7 Sports. Ryan, I know we're a little bit higher on some of these guys than maybe the transfer rankings, but first I'll ask you this. We talked a little bit about it, but heading into the portal window, what needs did you kind of circle and say, hey, these are the positions that Kansas State has to fill?
Well, I think obviously offensive tackle, as I said, was one that they absolutely had to have a guy, maybe even multiple. They ended up with one, and I think you can move forward into the spring and see, how Snee develops, see how guys like Gus Hawkins, John Pastore, Devin Vass, see how some of those guys start to develop in the spring. And then maybe if you have to reopen a transfer need in the spring window, you can do so. So that was one that was enormous. Cornerback was another that was big. And I mentioned, Fortenberry and Jaden Rowe had to come in and kind of, again, complement what they already had with some of the young guys. They really like Zayshawn Rich. Looks like they're going to get Justice James back. They've got Donovan McIntosh. They've got Kenigel Thomas. But they needed some guys that were a little bit more seasoned, whether they played or whether you're Jaden Rowe and you've just been in college long enough to kind of understand, what the day-to-day is like, what the demands are. And bigger bodied guys too. I mean, Fortenberry isn't, but again, getting Rowe to go with Zayshawn Rich and and Donovan McIntosh, I think, is enormous. So I think those were really the ones they had to hit on. Probably one that they ended up needing the more I thought about it, and going in, I didn't really think it was a major need, was linebacker.
Yeah.
Specifically getting a guy like Gabe Powers. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not as high on Gabe Powers. I think people see Ohio State and they're like, whoa, this guy's going to be, and he probably will be a day one guy, but he's got 50 defensive snaps in his career.
Yeah.
So, like, I'm not going over the moon above and beyond in my expectation level for Gabe Powers, but he fits what they want at the will linebacker spot so well in terms of his length. He can pass rush probably better than what we saw from Austin Moore this past year, and also cover kind of like Rex Van Wy does because he's got the 6'4", stature. So I think that's big. The one thing that I touched on in the first half that I did want to touch on here, though, is kind of what they're doing at wide receiver.
Sure.
And I think it's good, Kevin, but it kind of is that sticky situation that's not just exclusive to Kansas State, but the portal as a whole. With Kansas State, the amount of wide receivers they're picking up, I don't know how to address this like nicely, so I'm just going to be blunt about it. Like, they're either showing that they just hate their young guys because they're bringing in 4 new guys, or they're showing us that, like, they really have struggled evaluating with high school talent at that position. Because you bring in a guy like Jerran Bradley, you bring in a guy like Jerron Tibbs, love Jerron Tibbs. Reuniting Bradley with Wells, I think, is going to get him back closer to what he was at Texas Tech and not at Boston College. Gives Avery Johnson more length, more size, contested catch guys that K-State has needed for a long time. It's a more dynamic group. You add Medford in there. But, like, I don't know if they needed Medford. Like, I don't know. They probably needed, a Bradley and they needed a Tibbs. But, like, beyond that, did they really need any more? You've got Sterling Lockett. You've got Spradley Dimps, who was a guy that I heard about late in fall break and into the season as being maybe a freshman to watch. Andre Davis is a guy that you would think hasn't really scratched the surface yet. And they've brought in numerous other guys in this class. Nunu Concepcion is a guy that they went out late and were like, we need this guy. And I don't think I was told it wasn't because of who his brother was. They really believe in Nunu. You've got all these players, and yet, like, we're still going out and finding a way to get Caleb Medford and, going after Malik Benson so late, knowing what his dollar range was going to be in the NIL market. Like, to me, there's something there. And again, it creates a sticky situation for Chris Kleiman, for Clint Brown, their roster management and player personnel guy, Matthew Middleton, because now you've got, Trey Davis, a guy that I forgot about, and his speedy asset. Like, how do you go into that room now and talk to those guys and, like, well, we wanted you guys to be loyal. We wanted you guys to progress and develop, but we're going to bring these other guys in. And because they're from the portal, typically, Kevin, that means, like, they're probably going to get a little bit more of an automatic push to playing time and kind of leapfrog you guys. Like, it's a problem right now in college football. I don't know how you address it because you want, as I said in the first half, you want to get the biggest and the best, knowing that those scholarship numbers kind of are, you're constrained a little bit more, but I don't know how those conversations are had. I don't know, Kevin, how if you're K-State, you're having a conversation with Jordan Allen after you bring in Ja'Shawn Ross. Like, I don't know. It's a bigger question. KU's probably dealing with it to some degree. Sure. Missouri's probably dealing with it to some degree, but very, very, very interested. The positive side for K-State fans, that wide receiver room got a lot better like that. If there's a negative side to this for K-State fans, it's like, don't be surprised if some of those guys that you were hoping would develop and be kind of cornerstones for future years, might not be there. That's where we're at right now in the portal era, Kevin.
Well, and we're seeing movement in the second set of windows too after the spring when guys are sitting there because college football players are confident. One time I think USC in the Pete Carroll era had like 8 parade All-America running backs on their roster, and I remember somebody asking me, like, why do parade All-America running backs keep going there? And the answer is because every single one of those 8 thought they were going to be the guy. They saw the other guys, but they said, no, I'm him. I've got 7 really good backups. And so when you go to the spring, when you see some of those position battles sort of flesh out, and all of a sudden maybe, Duran Bradley is stepping in. Maybe, somebody else is stepping in and taking reps that you felt like you were in line for. I think that's where you have to continue to be honest and transparent. And I'm sure Chris Kleiman and his staff, they're very honest in general.
Oh, no doubt.
Bolden and his staff are. And so I'm sure they had those conversations through the portal, just saying, hey, we're going to bring other guys in, compete with these guys, et cetera. It's one thing when it's a theory and when there's all this. It's something else when you're in spring practice and you're like, that guy's getting the reps that I feel like I should be getting.
Yeah, right.
So I think that's where it goes. I like the Duran Bradley pickup a lot. I think not only is he a guy that has NFL potential if it all clicks, I think that K-State could use that body type in their wide receiver room. A guy that for lack of a better way to put it, that Avery Johnson could throw a YOLO ball to from every now and then up on the sideline and just say, hey, go be 6'5", 220 with your leaping ability, your athleticism, and make a play for me. And so I like that pickup. I like each of the receiver gets I think that K-State has. Like you said, at some point, though, you do look at it's kind of like when a basketball team, the coach says, we've got 13 guys who can play. And you say, well, okay, but 13 guys aren't going to play. And so you do wonder, I think everybody thinks they're going to play. But when you have a 7-man rotation, guys 8, 9, 10, when they thought they were going to be in that rotation, they don't. It changes some of those things. A guy I wanted to touch on real quick.
I hope it's the guy I was about to say. Keep going.
Were you going to say Gunnar Maldonado?
Boom, there it was. So I would be remiss if we didn't talk about him.
Yeah. So I was going to say that's another one that I liked in this class for what K-State wanted and bringing that experience into the back end. Because like you're talking about, I realize he's a safety, but I don't want to say you're starting over at cornerback, but certainly you're losing a lot of playing time at cornerback if you're K-State. What makes a cornerback a lot better? Your pass rush and them having backup behind them. And so I like the Gunnar Maldonado pickup a lot. Guy that's played a lot of football, Ryan, a guy that not just played a lot of football, but has found success in the Big 12. We talked about Trey Lathan earlier being a good get for Kansas. You have to say the same thing about Maldonado. There isn't going to be a quote-unquote level of play transition here for this guy. And so I really liked that pickup for K-State.
Yeah, I mean, real quick on Maldonado, I think he's my favorite pickup in terms of, you get an immediate impact player. There's zero question marks. Like, the fit is there. The transition, as you said, there won't be one. And again, you have VJ Payne coming back. Yeah. But beyond him, a safety room that they like a lot. But Colby McAllister is a guy that's played a little bit. Jack Fabris is a guy that's played a little bit. They really like Wesley Fair, Daniel Cobbs. I mean, it's a deep room, but as you said, Kevin, they needed somebody that, again, can help. You can lean on to kind of quarterback the defense from the back and also provide help for those cornerbacks that are kind of going to be a little bit of a work in progress right away. And with Maldonado, you can throw him at Jack, which I think is where he fits best because he can come into the box, because he can roam. But also, if you need more help in coverage because maybe the corners aren't cutting it, or you just feel like Maldonado fits better at free safety, he's every bit of what you would think of when K-State got Russ Yeast or Marquis Siegel at his best. Like, he can cover to that degree while also being more of that kind of jackknife guy that can come up into the box. Tremendous fit, tremendous get. I know it's just for a year, but that's the type of guy that you can absolutely lean heavily on this next season to be, again, kind of a quarterback captain of your defense.
Now we'll turn to Kansas, which has 20 transfers. Again, that's 8th in the country, but Ryan, actually 4th in the Big 12 because UCF, Arizona, and Oklahoma State all have 23 guys apiece. Now, Kansas still has room for 3 or 4 more, as wild as that sounds. But for now, the Jayhawks are 27th in 24/7 Sports transfer class rankings. The top-ranked player in Kansas's class is a guy I think both of us really like, Arizona tight end, Keon Burnett, who could really add some verticality to Kansas's tight end room.
Yeah, and I mean, he wasn't a huge threat against K-State when I was able to see him kind of firsthand, but in going back and prepping for Arizona, kind of leading up to that game, you're throwing on tape, you're kind of looking at Tetaroa McMillan and other guys, and Keon Burnett was a guy to me that stood out because, again, of what you talked about with his athleticism. Obviously he had a connection with the quarterback, with Fafita there. They played high school ball together, so this will be kind of the first time he's stepped out of that connection and played with a new quarterback. So I am curious to see kind of how long it takes to, develop that connection and the timing. But golly, Kevin, when you talk about Keon Burnett teaming up with Deshaun Hanukkah coming back potentially from, his injury with Kansas, that is, as athletic and a kind of a sizable group as well, in terms of kind of the more traditional build of a tight end that you can find. And that just seems to fit everything that KU needs when you want to run the ball, but you're also losing the receivers that they're losing. I think getting a guy like Keon Burnett that can do a little bit of everything and be that safety valve, enormous get for Kansas.
Yeah, I think when you looked at Kansas's offense last year, not that they were bad at tight end, but I think they had different sort of skill sets across that room. Trevor Cardell was banged up quite a bit. Jared Casey, absolutely maximized his talent. Wasn't necessarily like a vertical threat tight end like you would think about one. Where Kansas really involved the tight end in the passing game was the year before with Mason Fairchild. Mason Fairchild was a 4.9 guy, Ryan. And so all of a sudden you're talking about a guy that maybe you scheme open a little bit in Mason Fairchild versus guys like Burnett and Hanukkah, if he's able to recover from that injury, as guys that can get open down the field by running past guys. And
right.
So maybe adds another element to that offense. And Ryan, maybe extra important because Kansas is starting over at wide receiver and had to make such a big play at wide receiver in the portal.
Well, and looking at the portal guys that the Jayhawks were able to get at that position, I'm interested to see because there's going to be a transition. And I don't want to go as far as saying it'll be feast or famine, but it'll be interesting to see if all of those guys develop, right? Because you're getting Bryson Canty from Columbia. You're getting Levi Wentz from Albany. You're getting the playmaker Cam Pickett from Ball State. And then you've got Emmanuel Henderson. And Emmanuel Henderson is the guy you kind of want to lean on. He's the guy, obviously, with that coming from Alabama, you want him to kind of be everything in the kitchen sink. And then have some of these other guys, hopefully all of them, if you're Lance Leipold, develop and produce the same way they did at that group of 5 or FCS level. I'll just be honest with you, Kevin, when I look at the 3 kind of FCS guys at wide receiver, because I know you can talk more about Henderson, I really like Levi Wentz. I mean, if I was to lean a certain direction, I think there are elements of the other guys. First off, they all complement each other really well.
Yeah.
And they seem to fit almost identically with the guys that they're hoping to replace.
Yeah.
It's weird. Like they went out and found clones. But I like Wentz. I think his ability to stretch the field and go up and be a contested catch guy. He plays bigger than 6'2", which is where 24/7 lists him. When you watch him on tape, he looks like a 6'4", 6'5", like Quentin Skinner type to me. But I really like Levi Wentz. I'm intrigued to see how that transition happens, how quickly and how dependable these guys are for a Kansas, wide receiver core that's starting over.
Our fraternity house used to do Christmas, and one year we had to dress like the person that we had for Secret Santa. And so you're coming down and, maybe you're wearing a turtleneck sweater or something that you would never wear. And they're like, you're Bob,
right.
you're being that guy. And I say all that to say, to your point, it's almost like the new guys coming in, to some extent, some of them are almost dressing like the guys they're replacing, right? Levi Wentz is kind of that contested catch guy like an LJ Arnold. You look at Canty is a little bit like a shorter Quentin Skinner in terms of being that taller guy who's a little bit more of a vertical threat and can get open downfield. There's not a perfect like Luke Grimm type guy, I don't think, but in terms of Luke Grimm catching the short stuff and making guys play after the catch, he got some of their reverse and jet sweep stuff. that's kind of Cam Pickett in terms of the role that he fills, even though they're different. And then, like you said, you get to Emmanuel Henderson, who was Alabama's number 4 wide receiver this past year, and 4 catches. So it's hard to look at him and say, you're going to be wide receiver 1, you're going to catch 60 passes this year. But also, Ryan, like being Alabama's number 4 wideout, maybe not the worst thing in the world, especially when you think Henderson was actually the number 2 running back in his class. And so he flipped to wide receiver when he went to Alabama. If you're out there making 30-plus yard catches against Georgia in Alabama, Georgia, and you're getting on the field in that game, maybe you just need some opportunities. And he's going to be in for the spring. He's going to have every opportunity. I do think, to your point, I do think that him coming out and playing well is going to be a major key for this group. One thing I will add really quick, they're not done at wide receiver. Even with having 4 guys, they're looking like they're probably going to add a 5th guy to that room. So I don't know who it's going to be necessarily. They've kind of kicked the tires on a few guys, but it looks like they're possibly bringing in a 5th. Of course, Keaton Kubek is a little bit of a wild card coming back in that he was hurt last year. He was a guy they really liked in the spring. Douglas Emilion was a guy that played as part of the rotation a year ago, probably figures into the rotation somewhere. Is it going to be a starter? We don't know yet. But when you're losing your top 4 guys from a catches standpoint, you got to go out and get a new bunch of guys, and they did that.
And Lawrence, is there any PTSD when it comes to Anderson and like a Daylon, was it Charlotte?
No, I don't.
Is there any of that?
I don't think so. I mean, Charlotte was really interesting because he was highly skilled, but he wasn't necessarily like what you would think of in terms of an Alabama level athlete, in terms of just being, oh, this guy is explosive as heck. He was pretty good. I think with Charlotte too, there were some, I don't even know how to put it necessarily, just some stuff between Charlotte and the coaching staff that I think that kind of derailed him a little bit. He did have some moments at times, Ryan, but yeah, Henderson being a guy that has high potential, hasn't necessarily gotten a chance to really play it out at Alabama. You're hoping that in this situation with Kansas needing a number 1 wide receiver, with them needing somebody to make up all the catches that they lost, you're hoping that he hits the ceiling or really takes off this year. Jalen Daniels back, obviously, for Kansas, pulling the trigger. It looks like Daniel Highshaw is going to be back at running back. Looks like they could be pretty good on the offensive line again. So you really, really need to help Jalen Daniels out with those pass catchers in order for that offense to reach its potential.
Yeah, and the last note that I wanted to talk about too, that I think is interesting, I think it might signal a little bit of good news, I guess, if you're a Kansas Jayhawk fan when it comes to the offensive line, is they went out and got some linemen that I think you and I agree project really well. Yeah. And yet at the same time, maybe none of the guys that, at least from a tackle standpoint, when you talk about Harper and was it Tanner, that, maybe you feel immensely confident if the season started tomorrow. But again, you have those guys for multiple seasons. And so if they do end up starting this season, if you're the Jayhawks, you're feeling great about that because it shows that they've made very fast progressions in development. If not, I think it's good news because it shows, guys like Calvin Clements and those guys have stepped their game up. And it's not the end of the world because, again, you have some of these guys for multiple years.
Tyler Gentry being another one, he's a guy that, to me, if he's not my favorite guy in the class, he's a short number 2 and has a chance to win a starting offensive guard spot because Bryce Foster is going to be the center again. But the second Bryce Foster leaves, I think he's a plug-and-play starter for multiple years at center. And so that was a really good get. Look, Kansas had a lot of needs because of that just monster departing senior class. And the Jayhawks have done a pretty good job of landing some plug-and-play starters, but also getting some guys like Gentry, like Jaleel Hurley, the cornerback from Alabama, some talented guys with multiple years left who could maybe become kind of franchise cornerstones for you a year or two down the road.
Well, and last but not least, like we finished with K-State, we talked about a guy like Gunnar Maldonado that you and I both loved for the K-State class because it was instant, seamless. You know what you're going to get. Everything's there. Kind of that guy for me with the KU class where I'm like, love it. And it's very familiar. And it's a guy that I think we know and has proven he's going to deliver. And yet we're kind of not talking about him because there's all this other stuff with this KU class. Gage Keys.
Yeah.
I mean, what's not to like about that reunion?
Yeah, it's funny because Gage Keys going opened the door for Blake Harrell to have the season that he did. And Blake Harrell was looked at it by the end of the year as the best interior pass rusher that Kansas had, maybe even a star in the making if you want to go that far. If Gage Keys had come back, Ryan, those might have been Gage Keys' accolades.
Yeah.
They might have been talking about Gage Keys being the best interior pass rusher, as Gage Keys maybe being the star type player. And so I think when you look at that, obviously not just getting a guy that you've seen succeed in the Big 12, but a guy succeed at Kansas, you don't expect there to be a ton of transition there. He joins a good defensive tackle group, a group of guys that he's worked with before too, not just, Coach Jim Panagos, but also the defensive tackles around him he's played with before. That's a good one. I also really like Lyric Rawls, the Oklahoma State safety, coming over as another guy that's had some success in the Big 12 with him. It's just health, but you're looking to replace Marvin Grant, who both played in the box and out, that did a lot of different things. I think Rawls could see some of those similar roles where, he could be a high safety if they really needed him to be. He could also play what Kansas calls the Cinco spot, which is basically when their nickel guy is more of a safety versus a linebacker. And so I think Rawls is another good pickup in that group.
Well, I'm intrigued by this whole transfer process for both Kansas State, like what Missouri's putting together. It's interesting because you get the transfer. One thing the transfer portal has kind of opened up is, you've got these kind of interior Midlands landlocked region states that maybe aren't as appealing to these kids out of high school. And now because of the transfer market, they get to see the opportunities that all these schools have. And yeah, NIL, padding the pockets helps a little bit, but it's just fun to see some of the guys that end up kind of coming back around on an opportunity at Kansas or a Kansas State, where in high school, again, Caleb Medford would have been like, nah, I'd rather stay in the DFW area. I think now they see the opportunities. Transfer market there are big pros and cons, as we've already gotten to in the last 47 minutes here of the show. But it's definitely been a positive overall for the game, and we're seeing that in the college football playoff because it has definitely kind of evened out the playing field a little bit.
If you are a coach watching this, do not burn your bridges when you are recruiting a kid, because there is a pretty solid chance that kid's going to become available again, and you don't want to have that door slammed in your face before you even get a chance to get started. Well, thanks to all of you for watching and listening to the Verbal Commitment Podcast here on KCSN. If you like what you've seen or heard, leave us a like, subscribe, or hit us with a 5-star rating. Until next time, we'll see you on the trail, and take care.